Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the Jeju Air Flight 2216 crash. This was a routine flight from Bangkok to Muon, South Korea. It tragically ended on December 29th, 2024. It's a story that's captivated the world, not just for the scale of the loss, 179 lives, but also because of the lingering questions surrounding what truly caused this disaster. Our main source for this deep dive is Wikipedia's account, which uses eyewitness reports, findings from the official investigations, and analysis from aviation experts. It's like we're trying to piece together this complex puzzle, and we're going to walk through it together, step by step. I know many of you are already familiar with the basic details, but let's just set the scene here. Flight 2216, a Boeing 737-8AS, operated by Jeju Air, a popular low-cost carrier in South Korea. The flight had 175 passengers on board and a crew of 6. It was a route they'd only just resumed a month before the accident, after a pause due to the pandemic. Okay, so imagine this. Just minutes before their scheduled landing, air traffic control warns the pilots about birds near the runway. Then, less than 60 seconds later, the pilots issue a mayday call.
It's a chilling sequence of events that immediately makes you think bird strike. But here's where things get even more complex. In response to this potential emergency, the pilots attempted a go-around. Now, for those unfamiliar, a go-around is a standard procedure where pilots will abort the landing and climb back up and reassess the situation before trying to land again. It's like hitting the reset button when something feels off. Tragically, as the pilots were attempting this go-around, the landing gear failed to deploy. They were now facing a terrifying scenario, landing a plane without its wheels. In this desperate situation, they made the excruciating decision to attempt a belly landing, hoping to somehow glide the plane onto the runway. You can almost picture it, can't you? A plane full of people coming in too fast, its belly scraping against the tarmac. It overshot the runway by a staggering 250 meters, which shows just how fast it must have been traveling. And then the worst happened. The plane slammed into a concrete structure that was supporting the airport's instrument landing system. This structure, we'll learn more about it later. The impact was catastrophic. The plane broke apart, and the rear section detached on impact. Thankfully, 2 flight attendants were seated in the rear section, and they were the only survivors. 179 people, passengers and crew, perished in the crash. The aftermath was just a scene of unimaginable devastation. It sent shockwaves through South Korea, becoming the deadliest aviation accident in the nation's history, and the worst ever involving a Boeing 737 next-generation aircraft. But amidst the grief and the shock, questions began to surface, like what led to this series of unfortunate events? Was the bird strike the sole cause, or were there other factors at play? And what about that concrete structure the plane collided with? Was its placement so close to the runway a contributing factor to the severity of the crash? These questions weren't just whispers. They quickly escalated into public outrage, with protests demanding a thorough investigation and accountability for what went wrong. So let's delve deeper into this investigation.
Let's examine what we know about the bird strike, the landing gear failure, the controversial concrete barrier, and the steps being taken to uncover the truth about what happened to Jeju Air Flight 2216. Okay, so let's dig into this investigation and see what we can learn. As we mentioned, there are a few key areas investigators are focusing on: the bird strike, the landing gear failure, and that concrete barrier that the plane hit. So first, let's talk about that bird strike. Remember, just 6 minutes before the crash, air traffic control issued a warning about birds in the area, and then a minute later, the pilots issued that mayday call. It seems pretty clear a bird strike did occur, and it might have been significant enough to damage some of the plane's systems. Now, you might be thinking, don't airports have things to prevent bird strikes? And you'd be right, they do. But here's where it gets interesting. The investigation revealed that Muon International Airport had a surprisingly high rate of bird strikes. In fact, it had the highest out of 14 regional airports in South Korea. They'd recorded 10 bird strikes since 2019, which is, well, a little alarming, wouldn't you say? So investigators started looking into why this airport had so many bird strikes. And it turns out the airport was built near areas that attract a lot of birds, like a lake and mudflats. There were even recommendations to use things like sound cannons and lasers to deter birds, but it seems like those weren't fully implemented. So was this bird strike just a freak accident, or were there underlying issues at the airport that made it more likely to happen? That's one of the big questions investigators are trying to answer. Okay, now let's move on to that controversial concrete barrier. Remember, this was the barrier the plane ultimately collided with, and the Wikipedia article gives us some pretty unsettling details about its design and placement. So this barrier was there to support the airport's instrument landing system. It was a solid concrete structure built on a raised earthen berm. And get this, it was only 202 meters from the end of the runway. That's incredibly close. To make matters worse, they added a concrete slab to the top of the structure in 2023, making it even more unforgiving on impact. Many aviation experts have weighed in on this, and they're deeply critical of this barrier's placement. They argue that having such a solid, immovable object so close to the runway goes against international safety standards, which generally advise against it. Some experts even think that if the barrier hadn't been there, the plane might have just skidded further and eventually come to a stop. That's a chilling thought, isn't it? That the crash could have been less severe, that lives could have been saved if the airport had adhered to different design standards. But it gets even more concerning. The article says that the Mood Airport's own operating manual actually flagged this barrier as a potential issue back in May of 2024. The manual even recommended a review of the equipment's location. So there were warning signs, but it seems like no action was taken. So this raises some serious questions about how airports prioritize safety versus cost-cutting. It makes you wonder how many other airports around the world might have similar structures near their runways, structures that could pose a danger in emergency situations. But the investigation doesn't end there. They're also looking into the plane's technical performance during those final moments.
Experts have been analyzing footage of the crash, and they've noticed a few unusual things. For example, it looks like only one of the plane's engines was using its thrust reverser. Now, a thrust reverser is basically a system that helps slow the plane down after landing. They also noticed that the wing flaps weren't extended. Wing flaps help increase lift and allow the plane to land at a slower speed. So the fact that they weren't deployed means the plane was probably traveling faster than it should have been for a landing. It's impossible to say for sure, but these observations suggest there might have been multiple factors at play here, not just the bird strike and the barrier. Perhaps there was a cascade of mechanical failures that just compounded the already dire situation. As you can imagine, the crash sparked outrage and grief in South Korea. Protests erupted, demanding accountability and better safety standards. People wanted answers, and they wanted to make sure something like this never happened again. Jeju Air, the airline operating the flight, faced intense scrutiny and criticism. They issued an apology, but for many, it wasn't enough.
The South Korean government launched a full-scale investigation, going so far as to search Jeju Air's headquarters. And they even barred the company's CEO from traveling overseas. It's clear that this crash wasn't just a singular tragic event. It really exposed systemic issues and sparked a national conversation about aviation safety in the country. Now, there's one more crucial detail in the investigation that I want to highlight, and it's a bit of a head-scratcher. So remember the black boxes I mentioned, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder? Well, the investigation team managed to recover both of them from the wreckage, which is usually good news, right? Because those boxes hold so much information that can really help piece together what happened. They carefully transported those black boxes to Gimpo International Airport for analysis. But here's a twist, and it's a big one. Both recorders stopped working 4 minutes before the crash. Now, that's just a huge blow to the investigation, because those final 4 minutes could hold vital clues about what was happening in the cockpit, like what decisions were the pilots making, what challenges were they facing. Were there any warning signs of the impending disaster? It's like watching a movie and having the last few minutes cut off. You're left wondering how it all ends and what might have happened differently. So what could have caused those black boxes to stop recording? Was it a sudden power failure? Did something get damaged during that initial impact with the concrete barrier? Or is there something else we're missing entirely? It's incredibly frustrating, I know, but sometimes even with the best technology and the most dedicated investigators, we may just never have a complete picture of what happened. But even with this missing information, the Jeju Air Flight 2216 crash is a stark reminder of how complex aviation safety really is. It really underscores the importance of things like robust safety protocols, thorough investigations, and continuous improvement when it comes to airport design and aircraft technology. And as we wrap up our deep dive into this tragedy, I want to leave you with this thought. If even a seemingly routine flight can end in such a devastating way, what does this tell us about the inherent risks we accept every time we board a plane?
It's a sobering question, and one worth pondering as we navigate the skies and place our trust in the systems and the people who are supposed to keep us safe.